Welcome to our York Festival of Ideas session, in which we're inviting you to take a journey to the heavens. So I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers this morning. So first of all, we've got Dr. Emma Wells, who is a lecturer in ecclesiastical and architectural history in the university's Centre for Lifelong Learning and Department of Archaeology. So Emma specialises in the late medieval and Reformation English parish church, cathedral pilgrimage, the cult of the saints and the senses, as well as built heritage more generally. And David is a lecturer in railway studies with the Centre for Lifelong Learning and also in the York Management School. So David's been interested in railways all his life, since his grandfather took him to a steam railway at the age of 2. This then led him to complete a PhD in railway studies with the university and the National Railway Museum's Institute of Railway Studies and Transport History in 2014. If you'd like to sort of make a start of the presentation then.
Thank you, Kevin. So welcome everybody. So Emma and I are just going to have a bit of a chat about some very interesting posters. But we start with something that isn't actually a railway poster. So this is a poster by Shell, See Britain First. And I kind of pop this in here for a bit of context to the railway story, because this is, of course, a poster for a petrol company. So, Emma, what are we seeing there?
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, this, I think it dates from 1925, does it not?
Yes.
And what we see here is Durham Cathedral, the West End, which is slightly unusual perspective. We usually perhaps know Durham for its East End. And we can see the watermill there at the bottom. So to the left, for some perspective here, to the left would be the castle, Durham Castle, well known, Palace Green and the Cathedral Precinct. And what we're seeing here is those dominant great western towers, and as I say, the watermill, and we would have the rowboats usually on the river below. So again, what Durham is known for. It's a very well-known scene, a very common composition for painting, particularly throughout the Victorian and early 20th century Edwardian era. And it's sort of, I think, David, you can then follow on here, is that it's the importance of this composition for advertisers and why we're seeing this perspective.
Yeah, I think so. One of the interesting things is this is from the roadway. This is not that the view you'd get from the train. This is from the roadway, and they have actually. So the artist is Charles D. Forquery, who did a range of posters for Shell in this series, and it's from railway because it's trying to sort of sell the idea of Shell as, you know, this is what you'd see if you're going by road, but also I think what's important is this is a artistic. This is commissioned an artist to do a piece of work for show, and this is as much about presenting a nice picture as it is about promoting the company. So there's a academic called Mike Keller who's done a lot of work on Shell and sort of their PR, and saying that actually this is about promoting the company, and this is an era where Shell has a difficult relationship with its public. People are complaining about adverts on roadsides. They're complaining about these large corporations, and we'll see similar things come through on the railways, on railway posters. But what Shell are trying to do here is promote themselves as a company that is working with notable artists to show them it's good patrons of the arts, of responsible advertising. And I think that comes across. This is a very stylized, very artistic representation of the church.
Yeah, and I think, am I right in thinking that this was a Royal Academy artist who painted the scene, or they particularly enjoy them? So, as you're saying, they're sort of doing the responsible advertisement thing, showing the beauty of the countryside, and particularly as this era, we're seeing how people were worried about the destruction of the material environment. So this is sort of artists creating responsible advertising.
Yeah.
And going back to your point about the view, this is particularly interesting because usually from the train, from the railway, you would see the north side of the cathedral. And then, but this, we're seeing the west. So from the road, as you say, we get this view. And, we might ask, why Durham? Why are we choosing Durham of any cathedral city, or any city? But I think what's really important here is, we have Durham, which is the land of the Prince Bishops. It's the heart of North or Northeast England, I suppose. The history, the architecture. We think William the Conqueror, the Norman invasion, the dominant cathedral across the countryside, physically, symbolically. It's very dominant. St. Cuthbert buried here. That's why we have Durham, really. So it's essentially the North in and of itself, but it's, as you say, it's a more romanticized view of anything that actually, it's not too far from reality, of course, but it's more romanticized than one can actually ever really see, even as a motorist going past. But do you think then it's particularly targeted at those living nearby to Durham, or is this for the London set, if you will?
I think this is something we'll probably sort of discuss a bit more when we come to railway posters, but it's quite notable that there's no actual cars in the picture. It's not a modern scene. This could be an earlier period, and I think it's very much trying to conjure up an image of an imagined out of town location to try and compel people to look to where they're going as a sort of place away from the urban environment, as a sort of taking them back somewhere into a past. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to the railway posters. But I think this is a good segue actually into our next one, which is actually a railway poster. This is London by LMS. This is Norman Wilkinson. And what I love about this is that for me, there's a combination of the St. Paul's Cathedral, obviously. This is a very famous view. It's famous today, and it's also an industrial scene. There's a lot of bustle, riverboats, and there's buses. I think they're trams crossing the bridge. I see Kevin nodding there, but it's a mixed scene.
Yeah, and I think isn't this a similar date to the Shell poster as well? So looking 1920s again, this is an iconic view, like the Durham one, an iconic view of London with the St. Paul's Cathedral, busy river London life. The sort of premise here, though, is actually industrialism. The Durham one, far more idyllic city life. And wasn't this again a Royal Academy artist?
So Norman Wilkinson's quite important in the history of the LMS. In 1924 or late 23, the LMS commissioned Wilkinson to sort of sub-commission or get artists involved. Wilkinson was very interested in the idea of bringing art and advertising together, and he commissions these artists to produce a whole series. I mean, I think this one's a bit later. I'm not sure if this one's actually part of that series, but it's again that the railway's going for that sort of idea about, well, we're responsible advertisers. We're a big corporation, but we're commissioning artists, and it's an act of PR. It's an act of public engagement. What's fascinating is that idea about being a big company. The LMS claimed it was the world's largest company. It was certainly Britain's biggest employer after the General Post Office. So again, it's a period when the big four, so you have 100 odd companies before 1923, and then you've got 4 big companies that are created. It's interesting. I wonder if they were trying to sort of offset that concern over big companies, and there are statements of people being concerned. So it's again that idea of showing themselves responsible advertisers as large corporations that people are not too keen on.
Yeah, I think drawing on that, you're absolutely right that this morality is sort of inherent within this composition, that particularly as well as they've chosen a fine artist to produce this sort of work. And as you say, the sort of glazing over the issues, putting a veil, or we're seeing the issues through a lens, the same way as I suppose we did with the Durham poster as well. But you see this hustle and bustle, and London as this enterprise, this urban sprawl, everyone on the go, as you say, and pretty much everything besides planes, forms of transport we see. But again, like the Durham poster, we see London's offering, it's still a sort of utopian scene somewhat, but perhaps more so here wanting to provoke a pride of Britain, proud of industry as well as heritage. We're seeing them, one and the same next to one another, that the present has evolved from heritage, from the past. Look at where the smoke is next to the cathedral. And what's really interesting is that St. Paul's was built after the Great Fire of London in 1666. So perhaps this is my art historical hat on here, but I think that's sort of the phoenix of industry, rising from the ashes of the past, and transport literally moving towards the future that we're seeing in the foreground here. So, and I think you've said before that these posters were for international audiences as well. So we're very proud to be British, but also this is what you can see from us.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. There's a large number of these were sold of the original Royal Academician series from 24. I think it went into 25, so this might have been part of it, but a large number was sold to the general public. But about 1/10 of all sales were to an American audience, to North America. So it is clearly there's an interest in Britain overseas, and there's a keenness. But what's really fascinating, I tend to find is that later on in the 1920s, the LMS said employ an individual to write a report on poster advertising, and they say that the series was actually of I think it's something along the lines of limited, or not as much value as they might have originally thought. So they actually restrict to 1 or 2 of these sorts of posters a year rather than these big series. So it's like anything with posters, they're a bit of a blunt instrument in terms of advertising. So
absolutely, but I suppose the fact that they're choosing this is interesting in and of itself.
Absolutely. But what was really interesting is that in the commissioning of the original series, Wilkinson actually chose the subjects, and then the painters had to paint them. So I'm not entirely sure what relationship he had with the company in choosing the subjects. So that one's further research. So we've got 2 very different posters here. Emma, if you'd like.
Yeah, a very different style and compositions here. So we have Canterbury on the right, where history lingers, and this depicts the visit of Queen Elizabeth I to Canterbury Cathedral in 1573, and it's by Claude Buckle. 1930s, I think, reprinted 52. And if we start on that first, and we'll go on to the Bristol. But you can see this is very sort of, again, idealized fantasy of the Middle Ages, well, late Middle Ages, Tudor era. And Elizabeth is walking through the crossing of the cathedral, such a well-known scene. And it's really interesting that we're seeing the interior of the cathedral with one of our most prominent queens here for a railway, for, you know, see Britain by train, but you're seeing the interior of a cathedral. So I think that's extremely interesting here.
It is, and this sort of, what struck me about the sort of, what binds these two posts, and we'll talk a bit more, is the procession. And so the railways in this period were looking to sort of take people back to a place of where they can encounter history, to provide an almost sort of imagined past where they can encounter the ritual and ceremony without perhaps compromising, wanting also to seem modern at times as well. You live in a modern city, but I can go back to out of town to these places. But one of the interesting things sort of I found, and I'm just going to read this. This is from a railway clearinghouse, which is a sort of body that sort of coordinated the activities of different companies. This is a press release from the 1930s, and I think it ties up very well. This is a press release from the cathedrals of England, and they say that the journeying to a cathedral will take your mind back across the centuries to the time when men gave of their best to the religion they served, and left us with a wonderful sacred heritage which is unequaled the world over. So it's very much, you can come to the past, but you don't have to necessarily live there, but you can see sort of something that is great about the nation and its heritage.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because this is the era when we start to get the cathedral guides, as you say, Cathedrals of England, from Nicholas Pedner, and it's this, it sort of emerges from the mid to late 19th century merry old England, utopian Middle Ages view, and when we get Gothic with a K, when a lot of the medieval fabric of churches was restored in favor of sort of their idealistic modern version, and they wanted a more perfect view of the past, which is very ironic. But it's what we're seeing here, what England is known for. You can physically touch, you can physically walk in Elizabeth I's footsteps, as she's doing so here. You can do the same. Hence, I think, obviously, why it's called Where History Lingers. And lingers is quite an interesting word. Dave, do you want to expand on this? But it's...
Yeah, it kind of goes back to it. It's just like, you don't have to, so there's this idea of sort of the sort of tension in British culture between the sort of modernity that, you know, if we look at what the railways are doing this time, the streamlined trains, the speed, that we're a very modern, forward-looking country. One of the most technically advanced trains of the period, the steam trains, the Hush Hush W1 was going to be called British Enterprise originally. It didn't get that name originally, but it's saying something. We are a modern, forward-looking country. But at the same time, we've got here a sort of very historic projection about a sort of traditional nation where people can go back and find their heritage, their history. And what lingers might do, and I'm a bit speculating here, is it allows people to have both those things in their lives simultaneously, to sort of, you know, encounter history. It's still there, but you don't need to commit to it fully.
Yeah, I think we've seen this sort of relationship between the past and present throughout all of these posters we've looked at. It's, you know, visit these old places, but you'll also find modernity, progression, evolution. And that's still the case today with modern advertising. We want to show this ingrained history within England, but we're very modern, we're very forward thinking. It's sort of a look what we can do and look what we have achieved.
Yeah.
So should we move on to the Bristol one?
Yeah.
This is, I think it's 1933, this one.
So 1933, but I saw Claude Buckle as well. Very active for the railway companies.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're seeing the procession there. This is a period where you get pageants and pageantry in the nation, and this is you know a sort of local community pageants and things like that. So it's very much showing people something, you know, this very historic scene, but actually it's a modern, because we see the person on the right is actually wearing quite a modern suit. But it's again that idea of a place of encounter with history.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, this is the west front of Bristol, which has the great two large flanking three-stage towers. And as you say, we're seeing again a procession. It could be one of many, but that's why the west front is depicted. So again, we're seeing the past meet with the present, and it's really interesting sort of tagline at the bottom: a cathedral city of beautiful medieval and modern buildings.
Yeah.
So, and again, David, I don't know if you want to talk too about the period that we're looking at here.
I think there's something very very interesting, that something they've observed in modern advertisers is that in times of depression and struggle, that heritage is something that advertisers tend to veer towards. So we think about those Hovis adverts, they're very much, we're drawing on our heritage, we're a trusted company, we're a long-lived company, you can trust us. These are coming out in periods of strife. So we've just come out 1930s, and they're both produced in the 1930s. They've just come out just after the Great Depression. There's also, or just as the nation is coming out or is recovering a bit from the Depression, and then the second one is reissued after the Second World War, and it's a period of austerity. And so I think there might be something there to do with the idea that they're drawing on heritage as a way to reassure the public, to say, well, we can take you to these sort of trusted locations that are reassuring for you as a consumer. And I'd be interested to see how what the response to these posters were, but of course that's always a bit of a struggle.
True, but I think you're right. It is this idea of sort of, we are a trustworthy nation, and as you said about the boy walking up the hill with for Hovis, and it's sort of, when the chips are down, we trust in our past. And we saw this recently with the Novichok disaster at Salisbury. The idea that what was promoted was, come back to Salisbury to see our cathedral, come back to see our heritage. Yes, awful thing has occurred, but England runs on historical tourism. This is what you can come back to see. Yeah. And again, it's that trustworthiness in us as a nation and our history.
Yeah. I think that's a good point to move on to the next couple. So we've got two here. We've got Canterbury, Frequent Trains and Cheap Fares just called Griffin. The artist is just called Griffin. I don't know, it's 1937. And on the right, we've got Yorkshire Dales National Park Area Travel by Train, British Railways by Frank Sherwin, and that's 1953. I have a feeling that's a reissue of an earlier one. I'm not sure, it might be. But what I kind of like about, personally, my sort of, one of my favourite railway posters on the Canterbury one, it's because it's that very, it's a lot of heritage, and it's the small houses of the city, and then you've got the cathedral, but it's also, they've given it this sort of very modern lighting, this modern aesthetic. And I think that stems from the fact that Southern Railway was a company which had, it was a very sort of modern looking company. Southern Electric was its big selling point in this period, for the commuter market. It projected itself as this sort of very modern company in its advertising. And you get that expression bleed through onto a sort of heritage image. So I don't know whether the Southern ever produced posters like some of the ones we've just encountered, but this is a very different aesthetic.
Yeah, it's very different to anything we've seen thus far. And we have Canterbury Cathedral front and centre again. This is the West End and the Northwest Transept, which is very interesting because the Northwest Transept is to the left with the orange roof. This is exactly where Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered in 1170 by the Knights of Henry II. So it is actually showing where one of the most historically important events of the our entire nation occurred. But it's not the typical entrance, which is to the south. So it's very interesting that they've taken that perspective. But it is what Canterbury is known for. This is, as was Christchurch Priory, as I say, where Becket was murdered. But it's also the history of England in one building. We've got royalty, we've got politics, we've got religion, all rolled into one structure. And as you say, what's very interesting is this sort of stylized effect, this monochromatic, or double monochromatic poster. Quite an unusual color theory here. It seems to be, you know, correct me if I'm wrong here, dusk setting, I would say, something like that. We've got that something blue, orange, and white. Are we seeing a sort of stylized representation of the Union Jack here? The use of the Southern Railway in orange, David, perhaps you can elaborate on whether that was was normal for Southern Railway.
No, so Southern Railway's usual aesthetic is green. A lot of green. Southern Railway, if you'd see that in other places, it would be green. So that, again, it's quite a bold statement for a company that they've slightly perhaps taken this out of their usual color palette, which suggests that they are actually trying to merge two aesthetics there. They're trying to adapt their imagery to a heritage imagery here.
Yeah, it's very British. It's sort of British Empire, almost patriotic. And I wonder, perhaps this is a stretch, but it's a sort of orange, golden orange. Are we looking at, you know, the associations with royalty at the cathedral? Is this a sort of gilding? I think Southern Railway, David, you can correct me, that was about travel, was about going to sunshine as well and taking you out.
Yeah, so the Southern served the south coast of Britain. It served right from, you know, Kent right through down into Cornwall. And again, this is a sunny picture. This is a place where that you can maybe go to Canterbury and get some sun. But also it's a short hop to various other places around the Kent coast that you know, various resorts that you could connect to. So maybe there's something, you know, the thinking there is, you know, keep it sunny, keep it light.
Yeah, and I think moving on to the Yorkshire Dales, then perhaps we're seeing, again, David, correct me if I'm wrong, that the railways are trying to project, particularly through the interwar period, the 50s, etc., this idea of taking people away from the city, from the grime, to a more idyllic, idealized, stylized countryside, this merry old England once again, we're seeing.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of very big strand in interwar railway advertising. Alex Metcalf, who's at York, has done some research a lot on photography, and there's been a lot of work on posters as well from academics within York over the years, and they've sort of gone with this line that they're basically glossing over a lot of the sort of more problematic, challenging elements of the countryside. So, for example, there's the sort of creating a rural pastoral environment where you can encounter history, but without challenge, without all the trappings of modernity. The Great Western Railway, apparently, according to Alex Metcalf, would take photographs of the rural environment and scratch off any telegraph wires, so that when it was published, it pictured an idyllic version. And I think what also it does is it sort of casts out any sort of sense of conflict. There were concerns in the interwar years about the spoiling of the natural environment because of all these tourists heading off into the countryside, walking through wherever they want, hikers and ramblers. I can't remember which way around it went, but they changed in the literature, the railways, hikers to ramblers, I think, because ramblers was a bit less threatening to in the rural environment. Might have been the other way around, but they did make that change. The other thing is it kind of glosses over rural poverty around this period, of which there was a considerable amount. So they're very much trying to take people away from the urban environment, the hustle and bustle, to a more tranquil environment that they can enjoy.
Yeah, it's very much a sort of removed reality, and I think where we are seeing here, it's I'm not entirely sure, because it's very much, I think, an idealized, stylized scene, but it could be Coverdale, it could be Nidderdale, even Cravendale, but very much Yorkshire Dales, very typical of the landscape, the valleys. I do wonder if it's perhaps somewhere near Horton and Ribblesdale, because we have Ribblehead Viaduct. Seems obvious given the railway connection, how important that was. But it could be anywhere. It's very typical of that particular landscape. But as you say, these uncontested spaces, I mean, this is what we think of. I know when I think of a railway poster, this is what we think of, I would say, I would argue.
Yeah, I think it's what a lot of people's visions, and what for me is very how powerful these imageries are in the railway advertising between the war. Generally, how powerful it has been in shaping popular perceptions of the railways today. And you know, we think of the high-speed trains. We don't think of the unhappy commuter on the 750 to Liverpool Street. So this power of that interwar advertising period is so fantastic that it completely shapes how we think of the railways. But also, I think these posters both enhanced and reinforced imagery about the natural environment in England and Britain, because once you get it created, anything that draws on that imagery reinforces that again, so that they're playing a sort of relationship with the people who view them.
Yeah, we've got the typical elements as well, which is again what became synonymous with English landscape. You know, the hills, the moors, the valleys, and the church right front and center as well. You would think we might even have a railway line somewhere in there, but it's very typical composition. And it's interesting what you're saying about this idea of the spoiled landscape of what was an unspoiled landscape. And we see this also, that, you know, derives way back from the sort of 18th and 19th century, when we see, you know, W.G. Hoskins writing The Making of the English Landscape, when the lakes and Yorkshire became so important as a place of tourism. And although, you know, everyone wanted to come there, everyone wanted to visit, and these sort of particular components of the landscape were being pushed as this is what England is known for. At the same time, we saw the problems, which are always hidden from these pictures.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to sort of, we've got to that. So we got Stratford upon Avon. Tell us something about this, Emma.
Yeah, we're not quite sure who the artist is, I don't believe. Possibly Kenneth Steele, but we believe it's 1930s. On the left, obviously, the painting is more of it's interesting, it's more of a 19th century style. I would say it's nothing like we've seen before. This is Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. It's the East End. It's where William Shakespeare, the Bard's Memorial, is, and said to be England's most visited parish church. That's their tagline. But he was also baptized there. He worshipped there. He's buried there. He even sort of bought his plot, if you will, there. So it's essentially selling the birthplace of perhaps our most known figure, really, to Brits and also to those international visitors. But it's synonymous with England, and this is a joint venture, isn't it, David? Between
So this is really interesting, because it's a joint venture between the LNER and GWR, but also Stratford was served by the LMS at the same time, and so it's a way to it's a competitive poster. It's about come by our railways to Stratford, and I haven't got any points of reference in my head for an LMS version, but it strikes me that they're trying. You know, this is something we think of the interwar period as a great era of competition, and there was a lot of competition as shown, but also railways cooperated together to mutually support each other where it benefited themselves.
It's, for me, actually, I think it's one of my personal favorites, because it's so intricate, it's so architecturally stylized. We're seeing the memorials, we're seeing the perpendicular architecture, we're seeing the grave. just everything one would think of for a chancel of a typical English parish church as well. And there are similar ones, I think, Beverley Minster, Lincoln as well, these sort of ecclesiastical interior scenes. But here we're seeing these, these beautiful jewel tones of the medieval glass, focused on his memorial, which you wouldn't know unless you looked below and saw it was Stratford upon Avon, birthplace of the bard. You wouldn't, I don't think I would even recognize it from this particular painting, but it's more so this visual presence of our important architecture, which we're so well known for in England, rather than the historic act or the historic figure, really signifying the sort of the era to the average onlooker. But I think also that tells us something about the audience that this was aimed at, because you'd have to know a little bit more about it to take it further.
I think what strikes me about all these posters is that we've gone through them. We haven't, apart from perhaps one on the London one, we haven't actually seen a single train. And it's a really important thing to say, because this is about what the railway companies are trying to do. It's part of a broader thing. It's destination marketing. It's about the whole package you could get by rail. It's about, you don't just get the train, you get the destination, you get the service, and you get these experiences that the railways can take you back to. I mean, this could be a poster of the painting could be of any time period, within the last 100, 150, 200 years. I don't know how old the Shakespeare Memorial is.
17th century.
17th century, so even longer. But it's wrapped up in a broader package that the railways are selling here. They are selling a package of goods and services in one offering. What I like about the bottom part of that is illustrated literature and other information from company offices. That speaks very much to the way the railways tried to get their message through to customers. So it wasn't just the poster. As I've said, posters are quite a blunt instrument when it comes to advertising, because you put them up and people can interpret posters in very different ways. To go back to the Royal Academician series of the sort of 1924, one of the things that comes out, I've found, is that people, sort of the Daily Herald, that was the trade unions Congress's official publication, saw some of these posters of factories not as pride in the nation, supporting the nation, but as a symbol of worker oppression. So that speaks to the very different interpretations. So the railways need something to take people off beyond that sort of differential interpretation. And one way is you can get literature that will enhance your knowledge, that will take you on a journey from looking, seeing, I want to go there, to convincing you to buy the product that they're selling. So it's really important that they have that message, because this isn't it. There's more if you want to engage. So I think, it's about bringing all those things and telling them about all the elements they could get.
Yeah, and I think sort of adding to that, what's interesting is looking at the church itself. Medieval, early modern wall paintings, for example, were seen as posters for parishioners, for congregants, for visitors to the church. Bibles for the poor, some argue. But this seems to do the opposite, really. Still utopian medieval life or early modern life here, but in the church, the posters or the paintings were more warnings how to abide by the Bible, live a fulfilled life. But this is more about, we can give you information on all of that. The railways will help you to understand this past in order to understand and better understand the present. So I think that's a really interesting dichotomy there.
Yeah. So I think we should talk about Death by Heritage, by the wonderful Rubbish Seaside website.
Yeah, so this is a modern example of all of these. Death by Heritage of York here by Jack Hurley, which I believe is a 2019 poster. And Hurley is from Leeds. And he's created quite a lot of these similar type of posters under the Rubbish Seaside series, as he calls it. And what we're seeing here is a pastiche of the railway poster genre, isn't it? He's erased the problems, but we've seen this throughout, don't get me wrong. He's erased the problems. It's idealized version of a place from the past. and sort of it subverts and undermines and even mocks, I would say, past railway posters. You know, bringing this front and center, literally the reality of these places and how different they were in truth.
Yeah, I think this is it's an interesting concept of, forgive me, I can't remember the chapter called culture jamming, and it's the idea that you filter for other viewers railway posters or railway, you know, you modify them to actually bring out the messages that they're not actually sort of conveying. I think it's called culture jamming, but it's that idea that these people, these sorts of advertising pastiches or you know, satires or whatever you want to call them, will actually distort the view. It's like putting a light through a prism. It will distort the view to give you actually the reality, to give you something that is different, and that's what's going on here.
Yeah, it's a rose-tinted lens, sort of, with a twist. And you know, I think, David, you can elaborate, but seaside towns were often inspiration for posters, etc. You know, they're important, and we're sort of seeing the kind of seedy underbelly of many towns that particularly seaside towns too had, and creating this very English view, again going back to this 18th and 19th century English landscape creation. For the Dales, particularly Yorkshire Dales and the lakes, artists were wanting to visit because it was an English utopia, but actually a lot of these areas there was great poverty, there was great issues, and it's the same here. This is exactly what he's showing, just in an urban setting. But this
I think that's right, and a lot of the places, you know, that trades union congress idea that actually the poster blocks the view of people who are on hard times, especially around early 20s, another period of economic problems. And I think that is something that needs to be perhaps looked at and explored in a bit more research, is how did people who were living in the towns actually feel about it. So seaside towns, again, a place where there was poverty. You might get the seafront where, you know, you get all the bright lights, but actually behind the seafront there might be people on low income, very low income poverty. And so there's more questions. You know, it's easy to look at posters and sort of take away a certain view, but I think we need to remember always that they're just telling the story a corporation wants to tell.
Yeah, and if you scratch below that surface, you will see the reality. And I mean, we still see this to this day in New York, particularly the tensions between the stag and hen do's and residents and the council. And I know Durham, another similar sort of medieval town. It's that gown versus town tension that still lingers. But what I think is so interesting about Hurley's take on this is we're seeing, you know, a very important street. This is, I think it's Low Petergate. Yes, it is. I think it is Low Petergate. Yeah, but it's a medieval Gorpfest. I mean, York is in and of itself, but this sort of theme park of the past, but also of travesty at the same time. As soon as evening draws in, you get an almost Renaissance painting with the drunkard in the doorway and all the problems going on. And York always wants to portray the idealized city, but this is the reality. And it's almost going back to the 18th century with William Hogarth here and his depictions of the Gin Lane series, the Harlot's Progress series with the classes, and yet the drunk gentleman with the drunkard slumped. I think this is sort of the modern version of it, and going back to these earlier forms of advertising, which, as I say, we go right back to the 18th century. It's again, we're seeing some form of warning here, like Hogarth implied. You know, don't drink, don't roll around York at midnight or even dusk, as this will happen. So it's interesting that he chose railway posters to show this form of
I think it's because they are so iconic. They are so, I mean, the text is railway text, you know, everything about it looks like, and then that I think speaks to the importance of the railway poster in our sort of broader cultural memory about our psyche, about how we feel about the past and the present even, and a lot of our interpretations of railway posters and how people feel are shaped very much by how they feel about the present, rather than, you know, So.
And how everything is shaped, our perspective on railways, the countryside, everything is often shaped by advertising, which glosses over the realities, undermining the ideals, not only of York as a city, but also of railway posters as a medium, as an artistic medium. And that actually the reality was far from this. It's a sort of an odd homage, I think, to the golden age of the railway. And the great cities, that everything isn't quite so rosy.
Yeah, I am mindful of a mass observation report from 1939, the Social Research Service, that basically said that they surveyed like thousands of people around the country in different groups, and essentially what they came out with is that holiday traffic, people recalled violently, and that was the word they used, violently, bad experiences from years before of not being able to get seats on trains, or not being able to have a nice holiday trip because the trains were so packed or problematic. Don't really hear about that. So yeah.
No, and I think it ties into the idea that the wrong kind of people can visit, and as well as the fact that perhaps to finish, we should say that what Hurley is perhaps suggesting here is that towns and cities are very much like people themselves. They project the image they want you to see, as well as companies. They project only what they want you to see and how they want to be represented.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it. I think we should say that, I've got a slide just to say where we got these posters. So we got some places, but a lot of our posters come from our good colleagues and friends at the National Railway Museum and Science and Society Picture Library. But yes.
And that you can purchase many of these yourself online.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. I've always wondered why the posters are actually seen, because that's one of the things about railway posters. They always seem to kind of, they've stayed kind of current because they're so iconic. Mm-hmm. They've got that style to them. But I've always wondered, well, who are they actually? How are people? Who are they actually aimed at? How did people respond to them at the time? Were they considered iconic at the time, or was it something that came in retrospect?
I think one of the things that I've taken away from looking at the Royal Academician series is that there is a sense of what the people want from the railway company. People want fine art, but I think actually it might be sort of tempered by who they're trying to engage with. It should be said that a lot of the railway posters that were commissioned were taken around in exhibitions around the country. But they're opened by particular luminaries, like the Minister for Transport. They're opened by local dignitaries, the mayor. It's a PR, it's a schmoozing occasion. So I wonder if the railway companies who have been under political pressure from the late 19th century would also have a sort of more broader policy eye, looking towards, well, it's not just responsible in the public eye, it's responsible in political eyes as well, speculating that.
And at the same time, they're a very simple medium. We have great art on a poster, which you don't often see, and it's accessible, it's attainable to the masses. And particularly as the decades have drawn on, they've become even more accessible. You can purchase them to put in your home in all different types of compositions and styles. Therefore, they have become part of the artistic zeitgeist, really, of England, and synonymous with that as a result.
Yeah, it's really quite interesting, because it is sort of, it's a double thing. Maybe it's kind of reinforcing the image of the town or city at the same time as the kind of the corporation, in a sense. And I suppose it is that kind of era when corporations are trying to establish their legitimacy as kind of national bodies. It is in a sense as well there. So Shell, are they copying the railways here to try to gain legitimacy for themselves? Or do the railways come first, do you think, David? Is it more mixed than that? The other interesting thing as a sideline about that Durham picture is that you couldn't get to that view by car either. But that's because that's actually you could see that from a footpath, interestingly, but not really. but I didn't have political knowledge. But
yeah, I think it's an interesting one. Were you saying something previously to me, Emma, about the watermill on that one?
Yeah, the watermill is the building on the bottom left, with the two little chimneys, and it's also the where all the canoes are stored, etc. as well. So it's a really important area of the boathouse, should I say, a really important area of the city. You know, we usually think of Oxbridge with the rowing boats, etc. But here, Durham is just as well known. So it's sort of these very typical heritage composition.
Yeah, it's very constable. It's got a constable air. Yeah,
very, very typical constable type.
Mm.
Yeah, and it all ties into this creation of the English landscape. And what we're seeing here is these types of paintings, particularly as you're saying with them being Royal Academy artists, that was this era of creating art for the people.
Yeah.
it
all sort of ties into this.
And how far is the Church of England itself actually pushing sort of tourism? Is this a thing? So the railways are kind of promoting, or shall the travel industry, if you like, kind of promoting travel to kind of places of historical or ecclesiastical interest. But what do the church think of this? Do we know much about that side of it in this period? I mean, you know, it's making it more expensive to manage the churches, you know? But then at the same time, is this important for them politically? I don't know.
Well, I suppose this is the birth of ecclesiastical tourism as well. Yeah. Yes, and the fact that you can access these places easier than ever before. We see this start in, you know, the 19th century. You can get to the places much easier, and a sort of greater part of the population can access these churches, can access these cathedrals. So for them, it's the start of, as I say, church tourism, and that's why we start to get the great cathedrals of England guides. And it's here, look at these great churches, look at these great structures of our past. Here you can buy the shell guides, you can buy Pevsner's, which was, you know, sort of just architectural guides. And so again, we're all seeing this at the same time. It's, you know, come to England, you can get here now, and this is what you can experience, and here's all the information to go along with it. We're going to provide you with, I suppose as well, we're going to provide you with information with the ideal version of it. Yeah.
What's really interesting, you mentioned the shell guides and the Pevsner guides there, is that, you know, the railways produce their own all-line handbooks. So, you know, the holiday handbook and you know, the Great Western Railway's very famous holiday haunts. But what's really interesting, and this has been speculated by Alex Medcalf and various other people, that we don't know who actually bought them. So did you buy them? And then you might not actually use the railway to you know, you use them as a guide, but you might not actually travel by train.
Mm.
They were very popular. These things sold out complete runs. So were people using the shell guide to go by rail?
Well, yeah, I think it's a collaborative endeavor, isn't it? And we still have them to this day. Everyone's a winner.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, I still use them and Betjeman, etc. But I don't often. Well, sometimes I travel by train, but you might be by car. But it's the information, and it's promoting them. Yes, it's promoting them, but it's also promoting the site. So as I say, everybody wins.
I mean, the railway companies did do a lot with. So there were various agreements around the nation to do with. You know, the railway companies had hundreds of agreements with different resorts. Maybe yeah, I think it's about 100 or so for the LNS. Don't quote me on that, but it's a large number, and they had these agreements where they would collaborate with different resorts to provide finance to these, to posters, to events. So I think actually it'd be interesting to know, and something we don't know a lot about is the input of local authorities on these advertising campaigns, and how that actually, these things don't just come out of what the railway want to project, they come out of the local authority. And I think that the interesting thing for me has always been that the railways as this large organization what extent they dominated those relationships, and they say, well, you know, in Cornwall, for example, how much did, you know, different local authorities respond to it. And we find that different ones responded in different ways, but the railway company being sort of pan Cornwall, serving all of Cornwall, they could project their vision of Cornwall on everywhere in Cornwall, irrespective of how this little town or that little town might want to be projected themselves.
Yeah, and I suppose that would also bring a greater kind of awareness of not just the whole of Cornwall, but then individual towns as well, out of that aesthetic, right? So that's quite interesting. Yeah, and I think this is quite interesting because these sorts of railway posters showing kind of cathedrals and so on don't really tend to get quite as much press as the kind of seaside ones, as far as, so it's quite interesting to see it from that perspective as well, and the kind of, you know, the travel faster kind of posters as well that they do at the same time. So it's quite interesting.
Oh, sorry, Emma.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's quite understandable why the more, you know, typical countryside images were far more popular than these, because unless you are aware of, I don't know, architectural history or important events within history or ecclesiasticism, I think these seem to be aimed for a different market. They're much more of a, you know, particular specialist, let's just say, audience, whereas the others are far more mass market consumerism really than those. They're more art pieces with history at the center, I would argue.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I noticed when I was doing research on the London North Western Railway before the First World War, just before the First World War, they changed their North Wales guide from saying, well, here's a town and here's what it holds, to theming it. So theming it sort of for the historical explorer or something like that, to the individual interested in castles across North Wales. This is something that the railways are progressively, I think, you know, thinking about. What are their different markets? What are their different market segments? How can we make different appeals? So the railway appeals to different people in different ways. So I think this needs to be contextualized by, some posters are appealing to some markets or some particular interests, and these ones are appealing to a very different, well, not very different, but a different one.
Yeah, those interested in visiting heritage sites, really.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I probably wouldn't have thought of Bristol as a cathedral city. So, although it is, I guess. So, I'd have thought of it as somewhere that you go for industrial heritage more, although probably not at this time. So, I guess.
Well, I mean, isn't that the point though, that they're trying to portray the best aspects?
Yeah. So it's kind of drawing attention to somewhere that you might not even have thought of as a place to go, kind of thing. I think that's quite interesting as well. It's kind of drawing out unexpected kind of tourist narratives, if you like, which is also quite interesting.
Yeah. Talking of unexpected, I'm mindful of a press advert, not a poster, for for, I think it was the LNER, London North Eastern Railway, and it's got a monastic ruin or a church ruin in the background. But in the front, it's got Will Hay, the comedic actor, the film actor, when he was at the height of his fame in the 1930s. So I've always been very curious about that, because just like, what's the link between Will Hay and the monastery? And so they were also getting celebrity, but they were also getting celebrity endorsements as well. So they're doing a lot. It speaks to the diversity of strategies that the railways are bringing forward in this period.
Okay, so we're running out of time, unfortunately. So it's my job now to thank the speakers. So thank you, Emma. So this is really, it's been a really interesting look, particularly at the links between kind of or the ways that the railways were using kind of ecclesiastical images to advertise themselves. And thank you, David, as well, for bringing the usual really deep kind of railway expertise to the discussion. It's been really interesting for me to take part in. So I just have to let you know now as well that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website. So watch out for that. So if you want to see this again and go over it again, then you'll be able to do that. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. And thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Bye.
And Rosa?